Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about gender inequality. I found this picture on the internet and I thought this was perfect for the examples of the socialization process and social control and the influence other people, agents of socialization, have upon our identity, our behavior. You have to recognize that half of you is your genetics, but the other part of you was heavily molded by others in the social context, along with observational learning and all that psychological factors associated with cognition, emotion, and motivation, and things along those lines. But we have to recognize when it comes to gender, so much of our doing gender or our gendered behavior is heavily structured by the social context, specifically the culture that you were born into, the common way of life, how you were raised, your exposure to the social context, how people have instructed you as to what the norms and the values are associated with your culture. And then within that culture, you have norms and values attached to the division, into groups, into genders, based upon masculinity and femininity, which again is a blend of a biopsychosocial process. But we have to recognize that gender inequality, the origin of gender inequality, comes from the division of labor, or the dividing into groups, males and females originally, and then in modern times the recognition of intersex as a biological sex, and then numerous genders, which we are constantly socially constructing in modern times, which we'll wrap up the chapter talking about. But again, the initial division of labor, dividing into groups, terming, calling, labeling someone as different, and then attaching negative stereotypes. That's where the origin of sexism comes from, and gender inequality. Once we impose those stereotypes, impose a sexist system on social structure, social institutions, and our social behavior. So again, the origin of sexism, the origin of gender inequality, again, begins with the dividing into groups and then attaching meanings to the stereotypes, the attributes about those groups. And when you attach negative meanings to those groups, there becomes the origin of sexism. And then when you treat people differently, there begins the origin of gender inequality. And so again, judging people's gender practices, reminding others of the rules of doing gender. This reinforces the gender order and reproduces gender inequality. But think about how people have structured the way you dress, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you behave, the jobs that you choose, the types of toys that you play with. I mean, again, how much of that is your likes and dislikes on a psychological level, and how much of that stuff has been put into your hands and imposed upon you by agents of socialization? And then if you deviate from the rules, how often are you socially controlled? And now in modern times, again, we have challenged the norms and values of our culture regarding what's acceptable when it comes to gender, biological sex, sexual orientation, etc. But, again, the origin of inequality starts with the concept of difference, and then labeling those differences in negative ways, and then treating each other in differential ways. So again, in order for women to overcome 10,000 years of our society socially constructing a sexist society that oppresses women, keeps them from voting, keeps them from participating, we impose traditional gender roles upon them, and then we deny them access to other institutions. Again, these are all the ways that males have thousands of years now subjugated females. And it's only in modern times that you're starting to see major challenge to this over the last several hundred years. And this is not a global phenomenon. Again, depending upon the country that you live in, the culture you identify with, that's associated with the levels of women's freedom, levels of women's rights. So again, in the United States, we might have a bit of a skewed perspective compared to other countries and other cultures when it comes to our gender role attitudes. But again, you had a good way to start framing the women's rights movement. Again, go back to the first wave of feminism and the women's suffrage movement, where they were beginning to challenge this idea that women should be in the home. They wanted to become doctors and surgeons, and they realized they were quite capable of learning biology and figuring out how to do it all. And then you had that grander movement, which became the women's right to vote, which has always culminated in the suffragist movement. Then as tolerance or intolerance reduced, women, kept pushing that bar along with many other people that were not women. Again, it's a big social change. You had the second wave of feminism in the 1960s where women were demanding more access and more equity, wanted to go to college, wanted to become more than just nurses and teachers, wanted to become surgeons and lawyers and the President of the United States. And then in the third wave of feminism, which we're arguably in the middle, if not, we're moving on to the fourth wave of feminism. But the third wave of feminism attributed to the seeking of equity when it comes to pay rates, when it comes to access, when it comes to interview bias, and then freedom from sexual violence and harassment. Women historically have been stigmatized as a result of their membership in a group. And again, so based upon the groups you belong to, that's associated with your identity. It's also associated with your status. And since men had subjugated women and we built a social structure and a social system that subjugated women for thousands of years, women also received prejudice, negative attitudes, hence the negative stereotypes that all of us, even if you don't want to know them, you know the negative added stereotypes about women. You've been socialized into it. Again, we have to deconstruct these negative attitudes, re-socialize ourselves. Women are great at math, but I don't know anyone who hasn't heard that men are better than women at math. Even though there's no truth to that at all, we still hear the negative stereotypes. Women have historically received discrimination. They have been oppressed. They were denied access to vote. They were not written into the Constitution by our founding fathers. If they had been, we would not have needed three waves of feminism and a huge women's rights movements. Women continue to be victimized. 1 in 3 women still experience some form of violence. Sexism still exists. We can look at the wage gap in the chart on the left. And sorry, that's not actually the wage gap. That's the traditional gender roles in the family. I'm sorry, the chart we have coming up that talks about the wage gap, you can see that women are paid less than men. You can look at studies that demonstrate that men are promoted twice to every one woman. You can see how women are filtered into specific jobs that are not high-paying jobs. All of this contributes to the concept of the feminization of poverty. And again, victimization against women still exists, 1 in 3. How did males gain power? Again, it goes back to the division of labor, then socially constructing a social system in which males had power. Those were legally supported. Again, women could not get property. Women could not divorce. Women were not recognized as citizens by governments. And so again, if we look at it from a theoretical perspective, what's the purpose of building a social system? Again, who does it benefit? Males benefited by removing competition, by excluding women. Conflict theory, men and women have been competing for precious resources for thousands and thousands of years. It's only in modern times that a woman is actually enabled to compete with a man due to changes in laws and social attitudes. And then symbolic interactionism, we're the ones who came up with this world. We're the ones who constructed a world in which we denied access to women and we labeled them with negative stereotypes and we were prejudicial toward women and discriminatory toward women and we still blocked them out. Again, I think there's only been 4 women ever on the United States Supreme Court. We need to get a little bit of vocabulary to jump into gender and just so we understand some significant differences. When we're talking about sex, biological sex, we're talking about gonads, genitalia, hormones, chromosomes, genetic factors associated with your genetic sex. Gender is a perception of what you think you are, what group you think you belong to. Okay? It's completely arbitrary, and it's us who comes up with the categories themselves. I'm a huge fan of the queer theory perspective of let's just get rid of the categories, stop considering ourselves males or females, and then we just have this open door policy on we can all do whatever. But maybe that's not the right way. Maybe the right way is to divide into groups, and people want to divide into groups. But so again, there's so many diverse perspectives of gender. Should we have gender categories? Do we even need them? Should we have dozens of gender categories like we do now? Should we just have 3 gender categories, masculine, feminine, and other? What is the best approach? Right now, it's being hotly debated. So again, that's why we need to have these conversations, just kind of delve into it a little bit. And then when you're dealing with sexual orientation, you're dealing with attraction and biological responses and your perception. So, very diverse vocabulary. Again, genetically, you have this combination of X and Y for males, XX for females, and then you have hundreds of variations, though, which we call intersex. And again, that's the blend of genetics, gonads, genitalia, hormones, and chromosomes that come in so many diverse ways. And again, routinely, you'll find someone who was a male, thought they were a male, and they've had children, and then they go in because they have a hernia, and they find out they have a cervix and fallopian tubes and all of this stuff also. And so again, the blend of our bodies is very significant. But then the ultimate question is, how much does your biological sex, your genetics contribute to your perception and your sense of what gender you are? And again, that's the biopsychosocial process. Your genes are interacting with your brain structure, the neurons firing, and your cognition. The social context is, filtering you and guiding you toward these, constructs, so you have a sense of your identity, but then we frame our identity within social constructs, the groups we belong to, psychological attributes to ourselves. So again, it's an incredibly diverse process, gender. It's not just perception, even though that's the way we define it, because in the end, it's up to us to self-report what gender we think we are. However, society is also structuring you and pressuring you to identify with a specific gender based upon the biological factors. But gender itself is something that we create in the social environment. Whether or not gender exists in nature is a completely really good question that you should be asking. All right, so gender is, we have some theories that say gender is this continuum, a range between masculine and feminine. I kind of think it's maybe even more expansive in that there's more than just one axis between masculine and feminine, and that our identities within gender groups and our perception that we belong to this category has multiple axes that tend to go off in a lot of directions. Plus, we all have a blend, albeit women are more nurturing than men. Men are also nurturing. Okay, albeit men are more aggressive than women. Women are also aggressive and can be violent, just like men. So again, is the theory of gender more than a continuum, or are they exclusive groups? And that's a good question. No one has true answers to these yet. That's why we're studying it. It's science. We're learning. Gender is socially constructed, meaning the categories are created through social interaction. But again, they're highly influenced by your genetics. I mean, how do you feel? Do you feel masculine, feminine, or somewhere in between, or somewhere in a totally different axis on a different sphere, like a multiverse theory? That's kind of what it's like. But again, we have to consider the effect of stereotypes upon gender norms, upon the way we think and behave, because despite that we want to all think that we're these free individuals, we've all been structured by agents of socialization to act and behave in certain ways based upon a set of criteria. And again, once we're labeled that group, then we adopt and conform to the behavior of that group, but also attached to those groups are positive and negative meanings, along with ambiguous or stereotypes that don't really have any meaning, just things that we use to make sense of reality. But we're all highly influenced by gender norms. I mean, just look at the way you wear your hair. Does it match the traditional gender norms of what things should be? How do you dress? Are you allowed to wear a skirt? Are you comfortable wearing a skirt? And so we have a lot of questions here. Gender differences. So the idea that women should stay home, again, is changing over time. And I really want to go to this first chart. This one also shows the changes in acceptance of traditional gender roles since the 70s. And you can see that we've become more egalitarian over time, meaning that it's kind of like we can do whatever. It doesn't matter who does the dishes or takes care of the kids. But still, these traditional gender role attitudes that we've had for like hundreds and thousands of years have stuck around. And so people are still kind of sticking with it. Again, it's hard to get rid of some of these old ideas. But again, when we're looking at gender differences, you have to ask the question, why have we had traditional gender roles for thousands of years? How much of that is because of biology? Is it because women get pregnant and men have to be out hunting? But think about that argument. Again, women are not all pregnant all the time. there's a lot of women that just aren't pregnant at the moment who could easily go out and hunt. So again, is it because of biology, or are gender roles socially constructed? Where does that come from? So again, an evolutionary psychological perspective is going to look at like body limitations and body types and the way we've evolved over millennia and these subtle differences between men and women in our bodies, and then how does that affect the actual brain? And albeit there's even a couple of slight brain differences between men and women, the differences are so subtle that you would have most psychologists agree that the majority of gender differences between people are all socially constructed. That through social interaction and the dividing into groups and categorization processes, that's where these gender differences come from. And so again, a biopsychosocial perspective, you're looking at genetic reasons for why there's gender differences, psychological reasons, cognition and brain structure, emotions, emotion processing. And then sociology is looking at systems and structures, cultures, and the environment. And then anthropological perspective is delving deep into these cultural norms and values, figuring out where they originate from and completely understanding why our culture is the way it is. And then, of course, a historical perspective, looking back on thousands of years of history, the evolution of society, the evolution of gender roles, and asking questions. And then again, applying the functionalist conflict and symbolic interactionism. What's the purpose of dividing into gender roles? How do gender roles cause conflict? And then we're the ones who came up with these gender roles in the first place. But again, we have to recognize that your personality, your identity is a blend between genetics, the socialization process, again, that teaching and learning about your culture, and then your own psychological factors, such as the way you think, feel. All right. So we're also thinking about factors like, culture in general. Each culture is diverse, so therefore gender roles between cultures, you would assume, are going to have slight disparities. So we're also looking at the internalization of culture, perception, body functioning, hormones, arousal, how do you feel? It's just such a dynamic process to understanding gender. That's why I have that biopsychosocial, historical, anthropological approach to this, because it takes that much science just to begin to understand gender and the social construction of gender, and whether gender is associated with genetics and biological factors, and how does the way you think and the way your brain works associated with the whole process, because that's the one between everything, right? Moderating everything. So feminism and sexism. Guys, feminism gets a bad rap all the time. Feminism is simply a theory of equity. It says, you know what? People should have equitable access so that meritocracy can be a real thing, and it's not just about socioeconomic status to rise up the social class ladder. Sexism is the belief that one gender is superior to another. Again, that comes from the division of labor, and then attaching attributions and stereotypes to each gender. And then we've had social movements to hopefully reduce sexism, and we could argue these are feminist movements or women's rights movements, depending upon how you want to frame it. On a global dimension of gender inequality, again, we have to recognize, depending upon the country of origin you live in, is totally associated with levels of, women's rights in a country. Poverty is higher for females compared to males. Globally, 70% of the world's poor are female, and you got to ask why. Is that because of sexism? Is it because of biological factors? Okay. Women in poor nations are 42 times more likely to die in childbirth than in wealthy nations. Again, the access to health care for girls, for example, there's a big disparity in the country based upon wealth. And men tend to get more access to health care than females. Are we looking at the treatment of women globally? Is it violence against women that causes these disparities? Why do women experience physical and sexual assault? Why is there sex trafficking that's more highly women? Why are women more at risk for less educational attainment, less pay, a major income gap, less access to health care? Is it, again, because of sexism? Is it because of the types of jobs women choose? And that's the one that's on the left. Again, the higher paying jobs, men tend to choose those, and women tend to take the lower paying jobs, with the exception of healthcare. But again, how does healthcare flow into this concept of women being nurturers, for example? And again, the gender wage gap between men and women, you can just see, based upon age, you can see the level of disparities that they get paid. So from an intersectional approach, we're also going to look at factors like when we compare women to men. Women on average make 80 cents to every man's dollar, but a white woman makes 80 cents to a man's dollar. A black woman makes like 67 cents to a man's dollar, and a Hispanic woman makes 60 cents to a man's dollar. This one compared men and women, and it shows that white males make 12,000 more than African Americans, who make 6,000 more than Latinos, and then white males make 6,000 more than white women. Okay, Latinas make about half of what a white male makes. So again, if you just see the layers of intersectional variables associated with pay rates, but this is the concept of how many isms do you have against you? If you're a white woman, you're facing sexism. If you're a black woman, you're facing racism and sexism. If you're a black lesbian woman, you're facing racism, sexism, and heterosexism. If you're a black Jewish lesbian female, you're experiencing ethnocentrism, sexism, heterosexism, racism, all compounded on one, and that reflects on how much prejudice and discrimination and victimization you receive from society due to stigmatization and the attaching of negative stereotypes to groups, okay? 1 out of 3 women experience a rape or sexual assault in their lifetime. I have a daughter. This is a horrifying number. It was 1 out of 4, then coronavirus happened. 1 out of 3. 60 to 80% of the perpetrators are someone they know. 20 to 35% is a stranger. Why is there violence against women? Okay? Is it, again, the social construction of gender, the way we treat women, social interaction? Is it economics, the subjugation of women? Is it violence in the household, violence in the family? Is it family abuse? Is it just male aggression? Is it testosterone and hormone levels? Again, we need to take a biopsychosocial approach. People are violent, okay? Men rape in nature. So we need society to socially control our sexual behaviors. Even though I opened up with social control, again, we need some forms of social control to be able to check people's sexual behaviors. But what sexual behaviors are we needing to check? Again, we don't need to check, like, being gay doesn't hurt anyone, but rape does. So again, what should we actually have laws against? That's why we removed laws against same-sex marriage, but we kept the ones against rape. It's a little bit of a dark world out there, and sociology is a hard subject because you have to get into child abuse and physical and sexual violence and a lot of the dark stuff, war and genocide, terrorism. A lot of it's dark, okay, but again, we have to ask why. And then the overarching question is, what can we do about it? So this is just a chart with traditional gender stereotypes. Again, this is how we socialize people depending upon what group you're labeled in and identify with. And so based upon the group that you identify with, you then acquire these attributes. You start to act out these parts like actors on a stage. So are boys more aggressive than women in nature? That's the bio versus, social. Or does society, encourage males to be more violent and girls to be less violent, for example? Are men really more independent than women? Or is that just how we, treat them? Or we encourage men to be independent, but then we encourage women to work more in groups? Or does women working more in groups a biological factor? There's a lot of evidence to say, yeah, that's part of evolutionist psychology, but does that really hold up? Again, that's that nature versus nurture. That's what we're talking about here, okay? But again, these gender stereotypes, who does it benefit socioeconomic status-wise? Again, males are encouraged to be these dominant, active, decisive, head of the household. That's old school traditions that a lot of people still hold up. So there's still new traditions in a sense. But our attitudes that man is the head of the household, do we still have those attitudes in modern times? We got to ask that. But again, historically, our society was constructed in a patriarchal manner, meaning it was male dominated when it comes to the institutions. And we divide into groups, and then we treat you and raise you differently based upon the groups that you belong to, or we decide you belong to, or you are categorized into, okay? And again, the theories, functionalist perspective. Again, who benefits from this? What's the purpose of this? Is this because things work better with males working and women being home? Or does it just benefit men because then they're able to, take the elite social positions? So again, conflict theory, group versus group, these gender stereotypes contribute to males being in power and remaining in power and continuing to subjugate females. And then again, symbolic interactionism. We're the ones who came up with this economic system of capitalism, where one group is trying to dominate and consolidate all the capital in the hands of the few and remove competition. Does this inequality result from capitalism? So is it really economics? Is that an origin? But again, that all blends together. So how to reduce gender inequality? Is it possible? Again, it has been changing over time. You've seen the effect of changing laws against harassment, discrimination, and violence. But it still exists in modern times. But again, how has it changed over the last centuries? Go back to the 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and you can see the evolution of the change. And again, we are socializing people in divergent ways in modern times that maybe we have at different epochs in history, and where we encourage women to go to school and to go get a job. But what kind of effect is that having? Why are women having less babies, for example? Is it all related? We also need to confront the problem. If we don't talk about sex trafficking and violence in the household and rape and sexual violence, it will continue. And it happens all the time. That's why there's domestic violence shelters everywhere you go and places to help people like that, okay? We need to spread the awareness of threats to women's safety and the fact that discrimination against women exists, because if you don't expose it, then it'll just keep going on. We need to, have good laws and enforcement. How can our police officers reduce rape? Is that even possible to do it ahead of time? Do we just need to socialize our children differently so when they grow up, they don't end up raping? Getting some funding for help with single parents and, any groups in poverty, of course. But, again, the effect of having children upon women completely contributes to the feminization of poverty. Again, help with childcare, mentorship to teach skills, this general reduction of violence, okay? So again, thank you so much. It's a bit of a dark subject. It also can be a very positive one because, again, the gender you identify with, can have very positive effects in your life too. But again, we're in sociology. We focus a lot on the inequality, or we're in gender inequality. I mean, that's not going to be like the brightest conversation we have, but inequality happens. We're trying to reduce it. We're trying to spread the message. Hopefully it's having an effect. Thank you very much.